right, welcome everyone. Pray everybody had a glorious Feast of Nativity and Christmas and New Year's. Hope everybody's feeling fresh. You're safe from the snow. Back to normal life. Hopefully we can kind of just get back to things the way that they used to be. All right, today we are just going to do a one-off topic. We ended our series, and as I was praying, and I was like, okay, what do you say with the one week in between Christmas? And as I was reflecting, I was thinking about the gospel this Sunday that we just read this morning. It's a beautiful, beautiful gospel. And as I was thinking about it, I'm like, man, I can give 10 sermons on this. It's such a rich passage, and it's even more special for us as Copts, and you'll understand why in a little bit, but it's more special for us as Coptic people because of all the prophecies that have been said about Egypt and what it's supposed to be for God and all of that. So we're going to talk about it in a little bit. But the gospel that we covered this morning in the church is after Christ was born, the star shined upon Christ. I want you to imagine Joseph is going on a journey with Saint Mary. They're going to give birth. If there had been any confusion in Joseph's mind that who is this child and what's happening here and the Saint Mary thing and the virgin thing, if there was any confusion or doubt, not to say that we know that there was, but if there was, at this point, you have Magi coming from another country, from Babylon. The tradition tells us that they were Persian astrologers, and they're coming to worship Christ, bringing gifts for a king as he's coming. And the star shines upon the baby, and I wonder what was going on in the mind of the Holy Family. Wow, this is going to be the most beautiful, glorious journey. This little baby who we love and who we're so excited about is the Son of God. And people are coming from all over the world to come and to worship Him. So I want you to imagine how they're feeling and how excited they are. And I'm sure all of the prophecies are running through their head about what the Messiah is supposed to be. And He's going to be a ruler of His people, and He's going to be a king. And He is Emmanuel, God with us. That all of a sudden, all of these things are starting to come into play. The Prince of Peace, right? He is a Father, Counselor. All of these things are all right, let's get ready. So they celebrate the birth of the baby Jesus, and then they move on. But as we read the story, before we read the story, I want you to understand something about the Gospel of Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew is the only one that recorded this story, and the Gospel of Matthew is addressed to the Jews, okay? So as we read this passage, I want you to think like Jews, okay? I want you to think about Jews and Jews throughout all of history. What is Egypt to Jews? What is Egypt to the Jews? Say it. Slavery, right? Misery, long, painful journey. So as we go, Matthew, in his introduction of this story, is really trying to draw some parallels to the reader who are Jews. It's written towards the Jews. It begins with, the beginning of Matthew, begins with the genesis of Jesus, the birth of Jesus, the beginning of Jesus. And as the book of Genesis ends, right, we know that Genesis ends up being Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. What happens at the end? We know that the people of God, the children of Jacob, Joseph, and all of the children of Jacob and all of their grandchildren are given land in Egypt. They're given land in Egypt, and it's prosperous land, and it's good land, and they're there in Egypt. So you see the Jews, the children of Jacob, the children of Israel, go to Egypt. So it ends with the migration of Israel to Egypt. So this section of the gospel ends with the flight of the Holy Family to the same land of Egypt. Then you see, we're going to read in a little bit, the murder of the innocent children of Bethlehem, which parallels the murder of Pharaoh to the firstborn, right, of Egypt. So all of a sudden we're starting to see, and then, they're trying to slaughter all of the Hebrews because there are too many, so they say anybody that comes out of the womb, just slaughter them. And so we have two midwives, as the Jews were giving birth, were hiding the children, but they were called to slaughter the children, which is why Moses' mom put him what? In a basket into the river. So all of a sudden now we have some parallels. And then the Exodus, as they leave Egypt going back to Israel in the Old Testament, so we have Jesus also leaving Egypt and going back to Israel. The call of Moses at the bush is like the baptism of Jesus, which is basically saying that when Moses was at the bush and God is calling Moses saying, hey, you're going to free my people, also Jesus begins his ministry after his baptism. The 40 years in the wilderness of Jesus, the 40 years of the wilderness also matches the 40 days of hunger of Jesus in the wilderness. So what is Matthew trying to do? He's trying to say what you know of Israel and what you know of the people and what you know of Moses and you know the plan of God. Well, what happened to the plan of God? Jews are they're under Roman slavery, and they're there, and they're not what they were supposed to be. And all of a sudden, Matthew is trying to open up the eyes of the Jews to see the parallels as he's writing this gospel, giving the law from Sinai to the Sermon on the Mount. So Matthew chapter 5, right after Matthew 4, which is the temptation of Christ, Matthew 5 is the Sermon on the Mount, which is what? The law says you should not kill, but I say, so he gives a new law. And so all of a sudden you're starting to see the parallels between the first 5 books of the Old Testament and now Matthew. Why is he doing this? Because as he begins to talk about Jesus, he's trying to get them to think in this way. So let's read the passage. Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 to 23. It says, now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, arise, take the young child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and stay there until I bring you word. For Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, out of Egypt I called my son. Then Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise men, was exceedingly angry. And he sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem and in all its districts, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, a voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation, weeping, and great mourning. Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted, because they are no more. Now when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, arise, take the young child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the young child's life are dead. Then he arose, took the young child and his mother, and came into the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea instead of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned by God in a dream, he turned aside into the region of Galilee, and he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. All right. First, we see this story of an angel calling Joseph and telling him, arise and flee to Egypt. Because obviously what's happening is Herod is going to kill all of the infants of Bethlehem. Tradition tells us that they were 144,000. So also when we hear the number, 144,000, where else do you hear that number? In the book of what? Revelation. And it talks about, and the martyrs, and the voices of the martyrs crying out from under the altar about this deliverance, okay? These young children died for Christ even before they knew him. That they died, they were the offering, and Christ was the one that was delivered. So these children of Bethlehem have a very special place in the heart of God. That when we look to these children, that Jesus was the one that was freed and delivered, right? And he fled to Egypt. And the children of Bethlehem, the hundreds of thousands, They were slain for the sake of the lamb. These little lambs were slain for the sake of the lamb. Isn't that so beautiful? Makes me say, okay, as I look to these children and I say, Lord, for your sake and for the spreading of your kingdom and for salvation of man, I would like to be like the children of Bethlehem that offer my life for the spreading of salvation to all. That we don't look and say, oh, those cute little children, that's so sweet of them. No. We say, where am I in this story? Where am I in this story that I would say that I also want to be like the children of Bethlehem, not slaughtered, but that I would say that I would offer my life so that Jesus can do his great work of salvation. Let's move on. I want you to imagine as a Jew. You're a Jew. You're Joseph. You're a Jew. You get an angel that comes and says, all right, I need you to go to Egypt. What are you thinking as a Jew? What are you thinking as a Jew? We spent our whole history trying to get out of Egypt. Like, we don't want to go near Egypt. Egypt is a bad place. It is not, they are not good people. They are not loved by Jews. They are not the place that God is calling Joseph to take St. Mary and baby Jesus and flee to Egypt. This is so important. That Egypt was a place that was very, very dark to the mind of the Jew. Theophylact, the blessed Theophylact from the early century says this: he flees into Egypt to sanctify even that place. For there were two lands that were the workshops of every iniquity, Babylon and Egypt. By means of the Magi, or the wise men, he accepted the adoration of Babylon, and Egypt he sanctified by his own presence. Isn't that beautiful? That the two most wicked places in the world, in the history of the world, were Babylon and Egypt. Now Jesus is on site. He's a little baby. Babylon comes to worship him in the Magi and the three wise men. And now Jesus says, okay, we got one more to go. Egypt. We have to go to Egypt. God is calling each and every one of us sometimes to Egypt. Egypt is a scary place. Egypt is a hard place that sometimes God is going to call you to go and you don't want to go there. Not to say that Joseph feared or he fluttered at the idea of going. No, Joseph, he obeyed immediately. But this concept of going to your Egypt. Does sometimes God want you to go and flee to a place that you don't want to go? Does God sometimes have a calling for your life? You're saying, any place but Egypt. And that Egypt could be a place of pain, maybe a place of unemployment. Maybe it's a place of I didn't get into a grad school. Egypt is a place of you're going to go through a hard time, and you're saying, Lord, I don't want to go to Egypt. Why would God ever want us to go to our Egypts? Something you need to ask, and something we're going to learn from this passage that came out of this beautiful life and this beautiful story. You see, Jesus wants to do something very special for Egypt. And Jesus wants to do something for you to experience him in a different way. Every single one of us. You hear these Egypts and you're like, anywhere but there. Like, Lord, why can't we just have the good times? You imagine they're celebrating this beautiful baby and the star and these Magi astrologers. They're like kings, they're big royalty people. And they're coming and they're worshiping like, oh wow, this is going to be amazing. We are going to have this beautiful, wonderful life. In case you question, listen to what St. John Chrysostom teaches us. He says, thus you see at his birth, first a tyrant raging, which is Herod. He's a wicked king, he's raging. Then flight ensuing and departure beyond the border. And for no crime his mother is exiled into the land of the barbarians. That you hearing these things, supposing you thought worthy to minister to any spiritual matter, and then to see yourself suffering incurable ills, and enduring countless dangers. So what's John Chrysostom say? In case you think that when you hear these things, that all of a sudden you're dealing with sicknesses that are incurable, enduring countless dangers, you should not be greatly troubled, nor say, what can this be? Yet surely I ought to be crowned and celebrated, and be glorious and illustrious for fulfilling the Lord's commandment. How many of us get like that? That you think like, I obey God's commandment, I do what He asks of me, and He's sending me to Egypt. No, that doesn't make sense. That I followed God, why am I going through this hard time? Why did I lose my job? Why did I get sick? Why am I not following the plan that I want to have for my life? And how many of us we say, Jesus, where are you? Jesus says, I'm exactly where you were. I was born King of the Jews, and day one, like the very, very beginning, I'm headed towards no man's land in Egypt. I'm headed towards the place of darkness. Is it possible that God sometimes wants to call you to your Egypt? You say, why? What can be found in that Egypt? What is the experience that God wants me to have in Egypt that I want to have nothing to do with? He goes on. He says, what can this be? Yet surely I ought to be crowned and celebrated and be glorious and illustrious, fulfilling the Lord's commandment. But that having this example of Christ, you might bear all things nobly, knowing that this especially is the order of all things spiritual. Once again, John Chrysostom is teaching us that not everything is magical. That sometimes, not like things spiritual have to have Egypts. If you are going to identify with Christ, if you're going to experience Christ, if you are going to know Christ, if your spirit is going to come alive, your body is, you want success and money and pleasure and vacations and all these things. But the spirit wants something so much more. The spirit finds spiritual things in Egypt. So before we go any further, are you running away from Egypt? And are you escaping your Egypt? God has this beautiful plan to make your spirit encounter spiritual things. But it's not going to be beachfront, sipping a pina colada in front of an ocean. It's not going to happen that way, okay? It's going to happen in your Egypts. It's going to happen when you learn to follow the path that God has prescribed for you. How many times do we say, Lord, I can't do it anymore? Lord, I don't want to go there. This happens every New Year, where within the first few days of a new year, there's fires, there's fires in California. I forgot what it was last year, but people are like, okay, 2024 is going to be one of those years. And now we have the same things on Twitter. 2025 is going to be one of those years. And we already feel like, Lord, just bring out the good stuff. Let's celebrate the birthday party. Jesus says there's no more birthday parties. We're going to Egypt. We're going to Egypt. And you're like, what's going to happen in Egypt? What do you think is going to happen in Egypt? We know the story, and we'll kind of break it down. Jesus says, no, we're going to go to Egypt. And there's going to be something so beautiful there. And there's going to be something that you never imagined is going to be there. What he wants to say is, first, he too identifies with us in our trials. Hebrews chapter 4, verses 15 to 16 says this, for we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. I want you to imagine you're Joseph. Flee to Egypt because bad guy Herod wants to kill your child. Well, how are we going to be the shepherd of Israel from Egypt? How does this work out? I thought Jesus was going to be the shepherd of Israel. I thought he was going to be the king of Israel. What are we doing in Egypt? That sometimes we have to understand that what doesn't make sense, God is working. You have a high priest from day one. You have a king from day one that didn't get to celebrate his birthday party for very long. He had to flee to an area that no Jew ever wants to get caught. And we're going to understand why. Number one, God was giving Joseph and Mary experiences with him. At the end of the talk, I'm going to show you when Jesus went to Egypt, there were many miracles that he did in the land of Egypt. But I want you to, now here we are in 2024. You say, okay, Jesus went to Egypt, this heathen, pagan, barbarian land, as John Chrysostom describes it. What do we have out of Egypt now? We have an Anthony. We have a Saint Anthony that came out of Egypt. We have a Saint Athanasius, and a Cyril of Alexandria, and a Saint Mina, and a Saint Abanub. And you say, wow, if it wasn't for Jesus going to Egypt, okay, God wanted to show Joseph and Mary something new about Jesus. That he took them on this journey. He says, okay, I need you to go to an Egypt so you can start to see the way that this little baby is special. And sometimes God is going to take you to your Egypt so you can see how special God is. You're like, there's no other way? He can't show me like, he can't do something at the birthday party? No. God wants you to go to Egypt. That's where you're going to see the hand of God. Can you look back into your life? I want you to think about some time of Egypt. Maybe it was you were immigrating out of Egypt. Maybe you were moving to America and you were like going to a land where you don't know the language, you don't know how you're going to work, you don't know how you're going to survive. And so you're saying, Lord, any place but leaving Egypt. Maybe that was your case. And then you got here. Did you experience the hand of God when you got here? Did you see how God started to like open the way and do miracles and provide for your needs and show you that this place that I've called you to is the best place? I'm telling you, when you look back to times in your life where you went to your Egypt times, your times of struggle, did you practice Thanksgiving? Did you ever look back and you say, oh my gosh, that was actually a great time? When you went through a difficult time, that was a great time. Why? Because I saw the miracles of God. There were times in my life where it was an Egypt time, and when I look back and I'm like, I would not be the Abuna Paul that I am today in 2025 if it wasn't for those Egypt times. That if there's anything that God might have good in me, it's not because I avoided Egypt, it's because I went to Egypt. It's because I went to those difficult times and God started to refine and to grow and show me His miracles and show, just like I was with Moses, so I will be with you, like He told Joshua. I went through times where I felt like, I don't want to go there. I can't go there. No. This is not how this wasn't the plan. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He's saying, no, this is going to be the best plan ever. When Egypt's come in front of you now, and God is saying, hey, I want you to go to Egypt, you're like, look back, you've been to Egypt before. We're not young. You've been to Egypt before. You've had trials before. And what did God do in those times? How much stronger are you because of it? What miracles and stories can you share? Usually when somebody wants to share some experience with God, it's not when they were living the good life. It was when God manifested His hand when you needed Him most. And that is the biggest blessing. When God calls you to an Egypt, to a place that you do not want to go, it's to take you on an adventure. God wants to take you out of the ordinary to enter into the extraordinary. You say, can't we just keep the ordinary? Let me tell you something. People of God are never supposed to be ordinary. It never was. It never was in the church that the people of God were ordinary. No, from the time of when they were leaving Egypt and going into the promised land, like, who are these people? There's a pillar of fire that lights up their day. They got that pillar of fire by night, cloud by day. They have like food falling out of the sky. They part the Red Sea. They kill all their enemies. No king can fight against them. Who are these people? These are not ordinary people. These are extraordinary people because they're the people of God. You say, why? Because they came out of Egypt. They were in Egypt and they were refined in Egypt. And it was when they were in Egypt that they saw the miracles of God. Also, you as well. And we'll talk later about the miracles that they got to experience. But then you see, after they spent some time in Egypt, they were meant to stay where they were until God says move. Imagine they're in Egypt, and they were there, tradition says, for about 3.5 years. Jesus' first words were spoken in Egypt. He probably spoke Coptic. I'm not being joking, I'm actually serious. That was the language of the land, and that's, he heard people speaking Coptic, so Jesus spoke Coptic. His first steps were in the land of Egypt. Can you imagine this? His first real food, non-nursing food, was like molokhaya, I'm sure. Has to have been. That's why it's such a blessed food. Can you imagine that when Jesus went to Egypt and he started to bless the land, every step he took, and that's why Egypt, really, I'm not saying this because we're the just Coptic church and we're, patriarch. It is the light of the world. That Tertullian says if you were to take the martyrs of Egypt and the martyrs in the rest of the world, it says Egypt would outweigh the martyrs of the rest of the world by far. Why? Offering blood and lives and praises and glory. To the point where the crazy Copts were just lining up for this. There's a persecution in this city. Hey guys, let's go for a picnic in that city. Why? So we could die for Christ. You're what is that? But then, God is saying, don't leave until I say so. They were waiting there for 3.5 years. How long are we going to be in this God-forsaken land? Right? How long are we going to be in this land that has pagan worshipers and barbarians and people and temples of worshiping idols? How long are we going to be in this place? We are supposed to be in Israel. Don't leave until God says go. God was working. God was working. And all of a sudden, all the places that the Holy Family visited, we're going to see in a little bit, all became glorious sites of worship and change and monasteries and churches and places of healing and wells of water that have healing. All of these things were Jesus saying, it's not time yet. I need to bring more blessing to this land. I need to sanctify every corner of this land because this land is going to be for Christ. This land is going to be a different land. The only prophecy about any church in the world is about the Coptic church. You say, get over yourself. Isaiah 19:19, it says, and there will be an altar unto the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt. Okay? There is no other altar to the Lord from the creation except for our Coptic church. You know that the Jews could never consider an altar outside of Israel. So it has nothing to do with the Jews. So it has to be a Christian altar. And tradition tells us that Christ and the Holy Family spent 6 months in Muharraq Monastery. And if you look at the map of Egypt, it is dead center in the middle of Egypt. It is the midst of the land. It's literally nothing off. It is the midst of the land of Egypt. That Christ, after his ascension, took his apostles with his mother. They went back to Muharraq Monastery and Christ established an altar and he sanctified that altar. It is the first Christian church in the world, consecrated by the hands of Christ himself, because Egypt is supposed to be a place for Christ. You say, okay, it's not just because it's Egypt. What's beautiful is that Egypt was the only Gentile land, non-Jewish land that Jesus went. He only went outside of Israel to one place, and that was Egypt. And in blessing Egypt, he was blessing all Gentile lands to say that I am not just the king of the Jews, but I am the king of all of creation. That I am the king to all nations. My question is, how many of us try to escape our Egypts? How many times do we try to escape this hard time, this struggle? Let it do its work in you. Let it have its way in you. Don't just jump right away. Don't just try to find some other way. Abraham tried to do that. Abraham got to a place where God had called Abraham and says, I want you to be in this place. And it was a place of famine. And so Abraham said, we can't stay here. So he went to Egypt. And Pharaoh was going to take his wife, and he was going to lose everything. And he ended up, God warned Pharaoh, don't touch this lady. It's Abraham's wife. Left the lady alone. Then the next chapter says, and Abraham went back to the place where there was a famine, where he had built an altar. And it says, and he became so rich. And he had flocks and all of these things. And he had so many things. He was so rich because God was saying, go back to the place of famine. That's where I'm going to bless you. Don't escape. Don't leave your Egypt. Don't leave the place that God is saying, please let me work in you. Do you want to be saved? Do you want to be saved? Then you have to go to Egypt. You say, but I don't want to go to Egypt. I don't want to go there. But that's the place of your salvation. A little bit of hard times, a little bit of suffering, a little bit of purification, a little bit of struggle is where you get on your knees. I get people all the time tell me, where is God? I said, I don't know every detail of your life, but when were you on your knees most in your life? You say, I begged God because I was going to get kicked out of my college, or I was going to get whatever trial you were going to go through. And you were begging God. And you were on your knees. It was in your Egypt. When you're not in Egypt, you forget any of the goodness of God. Be honest with yourself. How much time have you said, think about something you prayed for, how long you prayed for it, God answered your prayer, and how much time did you spend in thanksgiving? Once. Thank you, Lord. Thank you for hearing my prayer. Now let's move on with life. God's like, get back in Egypt. Get back in Egypt. That's where you were so close to me. And that's why God will continue sending you back to Egypt. God will continue sending you back to your Egypt so that you can experience Him again and remember the time that I was on my knees and the time that I poured out my heart before God and the time that I experienced His miracles and His comfort during the hardest of times. Also, God sent him to Egypt to flee evil, to protect their Jesus. God wants you also to protect your Jesus. You have to protect your Jesus. There are things that make your Jesus go away, and that could be as simple as temptation, your envy, your jealousy, your lust, your whatever. And so God is saying, go and protect your Jesus. And that's what they had to do. They had to go to Egypt to protect their Jesus. They were called to Egypt to be a blessing. When God calls you to your Egypt, He's calling you to be a blessing for the land of Egypt. Let's look at this journey, some of the things that they did. Springing forth in a place called Tel El Basta, a holy well from the first century was created by Jesus. There's a place called Bilbais. It says that when they were moving south in the map, the Holy Family traveled to Bilbais. According to tradition, they entered the city amidst a funeral procession of a young man. Feeling sympathy for the dead man's mother, Jesus raised him from the dead. In the footsteps of Jesus in a place called Sacha. The Holy Family continued to the western delta. Here you will see a unique relic, the footprint of Jesus. The story goes that the baby Jesus was thirsty, but his mother couldn't find any water. When she placed him on the ground, a stream sprung up underneath his foot. Of course, Wadi Natrun is another place where the Holy Family traveled, and they passed by Wadi Natrun, which is where all of our monasteries are, and they blessed that place. And now we have thousands of monks living there. The child Jesus created a well in the desert, making this desolate area one of the most sacred Christian sites. So because there was a well in the desert that they had planned, it was a place where the monks could live and find sustenance, that God way in advance knew. The Virgin Mary's tree in Matareya. The Holy Family moved south to Matareya, a suburb in modern-day Cairo. There you'll find the holy sycamore tree, which once provided shelter for the Holy Family. It is also said that Jesus brought forth a spring at that site. The Virgin Mary washed Jesus in the stream, and where she threw out the water, balsam plants grew. Traveling south, they went to a place called Gebel Tir. Gebel Tir is a beautiful mountain. It says one of the most important pilgrimage sites on this way. It says, according to tradition, a pharaonic temple stood there, which crumpled upon the arrival of the true God. As soon as the Holy Family entered into Egypt, this temple just crumpled. It just shattered into pieces. And then it says, the pagan priests were angered by the destruction of their idols, and seeking refuge, Jesus placed his hand on the mountain and split it in two, providing a hiding place for the Holy Family. And you can see that place if you ever go to Gebel Tir. There's a beautiful monastery there, and you see the cave in which they hid, and there's a church, and it was a place where Jesus split the mountain so that they could go through on the Nile. God blessed Egypt. Egypt was no longer a place of darkness, it was a place of encounter. Flee to your Egypt. Go to your Egypt and encounter him there. That's where you're going to have experiences of Jesus. Of course, I can give another 5 sermons on this passage. There's so much more to explain, but after this, we see the fulfillment of the prophecy in Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, out of Egypt I have called my son. Well, he's not talking about the people of Israel, because it was the book of Hosea was way after that. It's talking about the prophecy of Jesus, his true son, was going to come out of Egypt and enter back into Israel and to fulfill that prophecy. May we not flee from our Egypts, but may we arise and follow the direction of God until he says, when he came to the end where the angel came to Joseph and told him, all right, now it's time to go back to Israel. God will tell you. He's going to get you out of Egypt soon, but when he accomplishes his work, that he'll tell you, all right, now it's time to go back to the place in which you are meant to be. But God has work to do in the meantime, okay? Glory be to God forever. Amen. Let's stand up and pray.